Before we look more closely at the big six air pollutants, let's talk a little bit about risk assessment and mandated standards. Taking and assessing risk is a very important topic. We're going to return to it time and time again. Now, you probably appreciate that everything covers a certain level of risk. Some activities carry very high risk, like smoking, and others ridiculously low risk. Risk assessment is the cornerstone of environmental decision making. These are studies resulting from evaluation of scientific data, and they're used to predict in a structured manner the probabilities of an occurrence in the future. Risk management, then, is the process by which the risk assessment is used with other information, such as budgetary considerations, to make regulatory decisions. The final result is standards. These are legal exposure limits. These are mandated standards. That means people must adhere to these. And they are based upon two major topics: toxicity, the intrinsic hazard of a substance, and exposure, the amount of substance encountered. The formation of standards is very complex, especially those over the long period of time and those for human health. We cannot experiment on humans, and we cannot experiment for a lesser toxicity on humans over 70 years. We need the answers now. Here's a kind of a fun graph. It gives you a risk comparison. This is the annual risk of dying in the U.S. per million persons at risk. So this means these are people who participate in this and how they're going to die of cancer. I mean, how they're going to die. That was Freudian. Because cancer is so terrifying, people kind of think that cancer is the major cause of death, but heart disease is 50% more likely. That is 2,800 deaths per million, and all cancers is 2,000. But the poor parachutist, he has as likely a chance of dying as getting cancers. The firefighters is a very dangerous business, as is hang gliding. But lung cancer has been pulled out because that is set for a few unfortunate souls due to an activity. Now, risk events can be taken as, risk experiences can be broken down into two categories. Risk events, these are personal activities and natural disasters which are actuarial, simple percentages. So we've got risk events, and these are just percentages of occurrence. Percentages. And then we've got risk via chemical or environmental exposure. The first one, like I say, these are percentages. They actually count how many people who smoke die of lung cancer, and they can figure out your likelihood of dying. They also can figure out how many people who drive fast will get in a lethal accident. And for cyclical weather events, for example, 10-year floods, 100-year floods, poor risk assessment was evidenced in New Orleans in 2005 with Katrina. The powers that be decided not to prepare for this level of hurricane in New Orleans due to cost considerations. Now, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration stated that 2005 was the 11th year of a new era of heightened Atlantic hurricane activity. So they knew that it was coming, or there was a good indication, the risk was high that they would get a very high intense storm. Now, this had been unfolding since the year 1995, obviously, and according to their risk assessment, they expect to continue for the next decade or longer. But what has actually happened? 2006 proved to be a much below normal hurricane season. And 2007, El Nino is expected to be a big factor. It can get complicated because neither year had large number of extreme hurricanes. There was no extension of that cycle that seemed to culminate in Katrina. All right, now, environmental and chemical exposures is more of what we're looking at. This type of risk is assessed based upon inference of studies done usually on animals or even bacteria. Upper limit exposures, they give them a lot more than they think is harmful because they want to eliminate expense and time. And they extrapolate back to make reasonable standards for the general population. Often those with weakened immune systems, children, the elderly, are exempt from these numbers. It's quite easy to determine lethal one-time dosage, but it's hard figuring out long-term toxic effects. So how much risk do we want to take on? How much regulation do we want, and how much can we afford? The general public is very uncomfortable with uncertainties. In other matters, there's rarely a single answer to an environmental risk question, and the risk must be weighed against benefit and costs. They obviously call this the cost-benefit. Two schools of thought. The precautionary principle. This says that industry must demonstrate no harm is being done before being allowed to proceed. Now, can you think which industry must employ this concept? The pharmacy industry, yes. Now, most countries or most companies do not at all adhere to this. Best available technology not entailing excessive costs. It's got its own little acronym, BATNEAT. This means that we do the best we can with our limited budget. This does not mean that they are necessarily cutting corners. It means that to totally go to another quantum leap up in cleanliness or removal of impurities or pollutants would be a huge leap in costs and is unnecessary. Because certain levels of pollutants in the air are deemed not harmful. So, now, what in the 1970s came along? Well, the 1970s was a watershed time for pollution. The waters were fouled, the air was fouled, the population was growing extremely fast, and something had to be done. One of the biggest pieces of federal legislation of any kind was approved. It was called the Clean Air Act, and it was a mandate to reduce air pollution and improve air quality. And part of its reach was these mandated standards. This is the list for our Big Six. Right? They are constantly updated as new information is brought in, and this is not inclusive. They look at over 60 different kinds of pollutants in most cases. In most, especially urban areas. They figure out what they should be looking for, and they limit themselves for economic reasons, and it's kind of silly to look for something that has not been found here and is not likely to be found here in Columbus, Ohio. But we have these standards. Notice that is in parts per million. Right? This unit here, this is micrograms per meter cubed. These are equivalent numbers again in different units. These are simply different units. And they are used depending upon which is most helpful. Same quantity. Same amount. All right. So notice too that we've got different times, and it is not simply multiplicative. I don't simply multiply one to get the other because the effect is cumulative. Effects are cumulative. They build. So you can have a lot in an hour versus 8-hour average. If 8 times 9 would be 72. Simply twice as much as that. So you don't, well, how do I say this? You're not going to just take 35 and multiply times 8. Okay? If you have, if you are going to be exposed to this stuff, you have to keep it down to 9 parts per million if you wish to avoid health problems. All right. Annual average, this is interesting. This is how much we can get in a year, and look how much smaller it is than carbon monoxide. This probably would be better suited as written as parts per billion. And remember, a billion is 1,000 times a million, so we would go 1, 2, 3. It would be 53 parts per billion. Okay. Ozone, what is this telling us here? Same time frame. Look at the concentration that a human being can handle safely. All right. This is exposure over 8 hours. So one could say that ozone is 100 times more toxic than carbon monoxide. You cannot handle the same levels of exposure as you would carbon monoxide. Okay. Now let's come down. They have not yet made the standards for particulates, which I think is interesting. But it's coming because these are becoming a problem, especially in the Midwest. Sulfur dioxide, one of the big products of burning coal, has these different time frames. The annual average 0.03 versus 0.053 for nitrogen dioxide. Not a big difference. Alright, you don't need to memorize these safe level standards. I would like you to appreciate how small these numbers are versus the far-fetched idea that a particle in a million is not a big deal. Won't cause you any harm. Look at this. Alright, this is carbon monoxide. As you know, somebody always seems to get hurt over the winter because they've had poor ventilation from a heating unit putting out carbon monoxide. Okay, this is parts per million, ppm. And the way to read this chart is to look at the how long you can handle, or how much your blood's going to take in, saturation. This is how much carbon monoxide is in the blood. All right, versus how much you're breathing down here. This is how much you're breathing. All right, now, this is up here, dangerous to life. This is the amount, 70% blood saturation. Oh my gosh, is lethal. So if you are exposed to 400 parts per million over 3 hours, you'll have 40%. This is going to make you feel really crummy. But if you're just going to be exposed for an hour, you can sit there at 4 times the amount of concentration. I'm not sure you'd want to, but that's just to know. Okay, now, oh boy, if you want to get into a coma or to get serious, dangerous to life, 3 hours at 1600 gets you pretty darn close. 3 hours at, like I said, 400 will simply give you a headache.